Hello everyone and welcome back to Bitwig Studio and Music Production. This is lesson 3.56, and in this lesson we're just going to quickly wrap up section 3 for a section that has been incredibly long. This wrap up is probably only going to take a couple of minutes. So section 3 was all about creation and also about getting familiar with working inside of Bitwig Studio, and having now worked in it for quite a bit of time, I can honestly say that I feel very confident and I feel very, just comfortable with navigating inside of the software and always knowing where things are. That obviously takes a certain amount of time no matter what software you're using. So even hopefully from the start of this video series to where we're at now, you can see that I'm more comfortable working inside the software, and therefore I'm going to assume that you are as well. The main goal of section 3 was to give you the knowledge to create your own music using only samples and effects processors that come bundled with Bitwig Studio, or if you're following along and you're using a different digital audio workstation, you should be able to, for the most part, understand what's going on and find those resources inside of whatever software you're using. So life is all about making choices, right? And art is really no different at all. When it comes to creating music, what it boils down to is having to make a choice. And you make hundreds, if not thousands of choices in every single one project that you make, even when you're using very few parameters or you have very few things to pull from. For example, we did our 5 sample challenge where we just had 5 samples, pan, volume, etc., and the arranger timeline. And even in that composition, even in the one I made, I had to make a lot of different choices and do a lot of different things to try to maintain interest and to get it to sound like something I had in my head. And really, in that whole scheme of things, there were still a ton of choices that had to be made. Now, in the digital age, in the digital realm, with digital audio and making music inside of the DAW, making these choices can oftentimes be incredibly overwhelming when you have thousands of plugins, millions of samples, hundreds of instruments. Maybe you have a little bit of hardware you can throw in, etc., etc., etc. You have just so many options. And although it's great, and when you get started, you think, oh my gosh, look at all this stuff I can pull from. When you actually have to sit down and start creating, that can get in your head, and it can be very difficult to even start a project when you haven't thought about all the options you have. And so then you spend hours and hours just scrolling through all of your stuff, being like, oh my gosh, I don't even know where to begin. So by limiting ourselves in this section, we were able to actually make music from start to finish without all that extra pressure of being allowed to do anything. And normally you think if you're allowed to do anything, the pressure is totally off. But for me, I look at it quite the opposite. If I know I have access to every single plugin or every single instrument that I have available to me, I'm going to feel all this pressure to have to come up with something greater than anything that's been made in the past. And that's just simply not the way music really works. Oftentimes you really have to limit yourself to just one or two things and make your track using that, because that way you can get more familiar with it, you know exactly what's going on. And for me, in working inside of Bitwig Studio, by keeping our options very specific to stuff we were covering at the time, I think not only does that get you more comfortable with the software, but with the music making process in general. With all the knowledge we now have, we could very easily make thousands of unique and interesting songs. And really, we could make an unlimited number of songs. Just 5 samples and dropping them different places in the arrangement creates totally different songs. And a lot of those are very interesting. Some of those may not be quite as interesting. But again, it's all about that experimentation. And for me, making music is really more about the process than it is about the final results. Also remember that many of the best records, or those that are written down in the history book, were made with very limited funds and or resources. So before this digital age and all of these plugins and all of these options, sometimes people would go and work in a studio and maybe they had a couple different amps they could choose from. They had a couple different mics. They had one preamp, one console, and it was like, boom, we have to make a record with what we have. And when you're really forced and you're really backed into a corner and you don't have that many options, that's oftentimes when the magic can happen, because you have to use these very few tools and resources to come up with a full album. And so you're going to have to use those guys in a variety of different ways and in very creative ways. Nowadays, it's like there's a plugin for this, there's a plugin for that. If you're stuck on something, you can find something that will fix it for you, as compared to you having to problem solve and figure out what it is you need to do to come up with the sound or to get the sort of emotion that you want to get out of something. And for me, it's always a lot more rewarding knowing that I've worked with just a couple of things and have been able to get all of these different sounds and try to get something really interesting to come out the other end. And to me, the best artists are the ones who could sit in a room and be given just a random bunch of materials and they're still able to come up with something. That's when you really are tapping into that creative side of your brain. So I hope that you've learned that some limits and bounds and just the concept of keeping it simple can really help you in the music making process. And as we go further in these videos and we start to get more and more complex and add in more of these options, always know that it's okay to strip it back and to go back to basics and making tracks with just 5 samples and, a couple turns here, a couple turns there. So many times when I know I have an unlimited number of options and I sit down to try to make something, I don't come out with anything interesting at all, as compared to just working with 5 samples and pan and volume, and those stretch parameters. It's amazing what you can do with those when you put your mind to it and when you really try to zone in on the creative act of making something. So I hope you guys have enjoyed section 3. Thank you so much for watching, and I'm sure we'll be back quite soon with section 4. Take care.